The day I realized I could be cast out of my own life was not when they lowered the lid on my husband's coffin, but when my daughter-in-law, standing in the middle of his memorial service, pointed her finger at me and said I had 1 month to leave her house. My own son lowered his eyes and agreed. The silence that filled the church was the same silence I had carried my whole life, and in that moment I understood. If I didn't break it there, I would be erasing myself. Before I go on, let me ask you something from the heart. If this story already stirs something inside you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep sharing stories like mine, stories that usually remain hidden in the shadows. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Knowing you're there gives me strength to continue. My name is Eugenia Miller. I'm 74 years old, a widow who sells cornbread at the Saturday market in a small town in Ohio. To most people, I'm just a gentle grandmother with her hair tied in a bun, her hands smelling of flour, and a smile ready for everyone. They see a woman who talks to her plants and greets neighbors with kindness. But behind that image, there is a sea of memories I've never spoken of, a weight that shaped me into the woman I am today. I chose to speak now because humiliation cracked me open. That service, those words, the betrayal in my son's silence, it all pulled at an old wound that had never really healed. Losing a house wasn't the true pain. It was the echo of being cast out of myself, just as I had been as a girl, when men who should have protected me instead took everything. This time I refused to stay quiet. Even now, at my kitchen table with my back bent from years of work, I feel my hands tremble as I speak. I talk to you as I would to my grandchildren over a warm cup of coffee, with pauses, with shame, but also with courage. I don't seek pity. I seek truth. And if my truth finds a home in someone listening, then I will have broken more than just my own silence. Life taught me that words left unsaid rot inside you. They turn heavy, bitter, eating away at your spirit. Every sentence I let out now feels like a breath of freedom, even when it burns my throat with tears. My voice may shake, but it is still mine. And after so many years, that alone is a kind of victory. Deciding to tell this hasn't been easy. Many nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing my mother's voice in memory. She would tell me as she always did, "Speak, daughter. Silence only feeds the monsters." It is her voice that steadies me, her hands that I still imagine smoothing my hair, urging me to keep going. So here I am, Eugenia, widow, grandmother, market woman, but also a survivor of a childhood that was stolen, of abuses hidden behind the masks of respectability. I invite you to walk with me now through those memories. There will be tenderness, and there will be wounds. The girl I was bore, scars too early, but the woman I became, learned how to stand. I remember my childhood as a patchwork quilt of simple moments, stitched together with scents and sounds that never faded. Our house was a small wooden frame, home in the countryside of Ohio, with squeaky floors and walls that smelled of soap and firewood. Around us stretched cornfields that glowed golden in summer, swaying under the breeze as though whispering secrets. We had little in the way of money, but inside those walls lived a wealth invisible to others. The laughter of my brothers, the songs of my mother, the steady presence of my father. Mornings began with dew glistening on the grass, and the kitchen filling with the smell of biscuits or fried eggs sizzling in a pan. I helped my mother sweep the porch, my small hands clutching the broom while she hummed hymns passed down from her grandmother. We kept chickens, and it was my job to gather the warm eggs from the nesting boxes, careful not to crack them. Those little chores, far from burdens, felt like threads binding me to the rhythm of our home. My father was a man of few words, but every night, before I fell asleep, he kissed my forehead. That simple ritual was enough to make me feel the world was steady. Sundays were our special days. After church, where hymns echoed through the rafters, we returned home to eat pot roast or stew with vegetables from the garden. It wasn't a feast by worldly standards, but to me, it felt like abundance. Those meals tasted of belonging, of family. I often took my younger brothers to the creek that ran near the edge of our land. We tossed pebbles into the water, daring each other to see whose stone would skip the farthest. I made up stories for them about fairies hiding in the trees or cowboys riding through the tall grass. They believed me with wide eyes and easy laughter. Protecting them, entertaining them was already my calling, one that would later shape my entire life. Our town was small. Everyone knew each other by name. Afternoons carried the sound of the church bell, marking the rhythm of our days. I ran barefoot along dusty roads, waving at neighbors who always had a kind word or a wave. There was a woman, Mrs. Thompson, who ran the bakery and sometimes slipped me day-old bread wrapped in paper. Such gestures filled my heart with trust, teaching me that kindness was a kind of wealth we could all share. The summers smelled of ripe tomatoes and fresh hay, of laundry drying under the hot sun. My mother washed clothes in big metal tubs, scrubbing with her strong hands, and I helped her hang sheets across the lines. Watching them billow against the wide blue sky gave me a sense of endlessness, as if the world could hold us safely forever. Winters were harsh, the cold seeping through every crack, yet we found warmth around the wood stove, huddled beneath patchwork quilts. My mother told stories while she sewed, her voice steady as the wind howled outside. Those nights taught me that stories could be shelter, that words themselves could keep the dark at bay. It was then that I fell in love with the power of telling and remembering. My mother had a gift for making much out of little. With beans, onions, and cornbread, she could turn dinner into a banquet. She often sang while she cooked, and I would watch her, fascinated by the way her face softened in the glow of the lamp. She was gentle, but her quiet strength guided us more firmly than any harsh hand could. She became the model I would cling to in years when strength was demanded of me. I attended the town schoolhouse, a simple building with wooden desks worn smooth by generations of children. I loved the smell of chalk dust and the sound of pencils scratching on paper. I was happiest when the teacher praised my essays, telling me I had a gift with words. Writing gave me a small sense of ownership, like I could bottle up the world and keep it safe. Our games were simple, but full of joy. We played tag in the fields, made hopscotch boards in the dirt, raced until our lungs burned. We had no store-bought toys, but our imaginations were richer than anything money could buy. By evening, I would return home dirty, hungry, but filled with a sense of triumph, ready for the warmth of supper and the gentle hand of my mother smoothing my hair. We had a dog named Duke, a scrappy mutt who followed us everywhere. He barked at strangers and curled up against us in winter like a furry guardian. At night I liked to rest my hand on his coarse fur, comforted by his steady breathing. To me, he was proof that loyalty and love could come from the simplest of companions. The fields around our home became my refuge. I lay in the tall grass, tracing shapes in the clouds, dreaming of distant places I had never seen. Someday, I told myself, though I didn't know what that someday would look like. At that time, I believed the world could only be as wide as the land around me, and that land, with its seasons and silences, felt eternal. Market days brought the town alive, the streets filled with stands of apples, corn, and bolts of fabric. The chatter, the smells, the bright colors all swirled together into something magical. I often stood beside my mother, helping her sell small embroidery pieces she stitched in the evenings. Those exchanges taught me that hard work had dignity, that even the humblest creation held value. During the 4th of July celebrations, fireworks lit the sky above our little town square. People danced, fiddles played, children twirled sparklers in the air. My mother always sewed me a simple dress for the occasion. It might have been plain to others, but when I spun beneath the lanterns, I felt like a princess. For one night, the whole world seemed to glow with light and possibility. On Saturday afternoons, My father sometimes took me on quiet walks through the woods. He rarely spoke, but would point to a bird or explain how to tell when rain was coming by watching the sky. Those walks were his way of showing love, and I cherished them. They taught me to notice details, to listen to the world even in silence. Each night, before sleep, my mother would sit on my bed and stroke my hair, whispering, "Everything will be all right." That phrase became my invisible shield. Even when I was afraid of the dark, her words wrapped around me like a blanket. To this day, 74 years later, I can still hear her voice in my heart. In those years, I thought nothing could shatter our little world. The creaky house, the laughter of my brothers, the gentleness of my mother, and the steady presence of my father felt like an unbreakable fortress. I believed childhood would last forever, that life would always be this simple, this safe. What I didn't know was that life had already prepared the knife that would cut through that innocence. The days of warmth and laughter were only the opening chapter of a story marked by loss, silence, and survival. Looking back now, I see that those happy memories were not just a beginning. They were the treasure I clung to when everything else collapsed. The summer my mother fell ill began like all the others, with cicadas buzzing in the heat and cornfields shimmering under the sun. At first it was only a cough. Then came the fever that no tea, no prayer, no home remedy could touch. I watched her shrink into the bed, her once strong hands trembling as she tried to fold laundry or stir a pot. The house grew heavy with worry, every corner filled with the sound of labored breathing. Even at 10 years old, I felt the shift. Something was leaving us. The neighbors came with casseroles and quiet sympathy. The local doctor visited, speaking in hushed tones that didn't hide the truth. My father's eyes sank deeper into his face with every passing day. I tried to shield my brothers, making up games and stories so they wouldn't hear the sickness in the next room. But at night, when the house was silent, I pressed my ear against the door and listened to the rasp of her lungs, praying with all my might for a miracle. The day she died is burned into me like fire. It was an overcast afternoon, the sky gray as if it too had lowered its head. I was holding her hand when it went cold. I remember thinking the world had cracked open under my feet. My father wept at the foot of the bed, silent, broken, and I, too young to understand, too old to ignore, knew life had ended as I knew it. From that moment on, childhood was no longer mine. Her funeral was a blur of hymns and black dresses, of neighbors patting my father's back and whispering condolences. I did not cry. I couldn't. My little brothers clutched my hands, and I made a vow in silence. I would take care of them. My tears would have to wait. That was the moment I crossed from girlhood into a role I hadn't chosen. The house lost its music after that. The smell of biscuits no longer filled the kitchen. The warmth of her voice no longer carried through the rooms. My father retreated into his grief, spending long hours in the fields or at the tavern. We became shadows of what we once were, stumbling through days without guidance. Then, into that emptiness, my father's brother arrived. His name was Richard. To the town, he was a man of integrity. Steady job at the hardware store, first pew at church, a polite word for everyone. He came to help, people said. I remember the day he walked through our door. He wore a dark suit and tipped his hat solemnly, his voice soft as he told us he was there to take care of things. To the neighbors, he looked like salvation, but as he set his hat on the peg where my father used to hang his jacket, a chill went through me. Something in me recoiled, though I didn't yet have words for it. From then on, our lives rearranged themselves around him. He began managing our meals, our chores, even the money in the jar my father had always kept above the sink. My father, broken by grief, offered no resistance. To the town, we were lucky to have a man like Richard watching over us. But inside our walls, his presence was like smoke, thick, choking, impossible to escape. I began to notice the weight of his eyes, the way his voice shifted when no one else could hear. What others saw as kindness I recognized as something else, something colder. He told me once, in a low voice, "Who would believe you?" Those words lodged in me like a nail. Even though nothing had yet happened that I could name, the fear was already alive, pulsing under my skin. My brothers laughed and played as if nothing had changed. They accepted his gifts, his attention, believing he was the uncle who came to protect us. But I carried the knowledge that something dangerous had entered our home. The loss of my mother had been the first crack. Richard was the force that would drive it wide open, and so it was. The end of my mother's life was also the end of my safety. What remained was a childhood interrupted, a house filled with shadows, and the looming presence of a man who wore respect on the outside, but carried something far darker within. Uncle Richard began with the smallest of intrusions. He moved my father's jacket from its usual peg and hung his hat there instead, as if marking territory. He rearranged the sugar jar, commenting that it made more sense on the other shelf. At first it seemed harmless, almost helpful, but I felt the displacement, the way he was planting himself in every corner. That first night, he walked through each room before bed, inspecting windows and doors like a self-appointed warden. "Gotta keep the cold and strangers out," he said softly. His words never rose, yet they pressed down on me like weight I couldn't lift. Soon our daily rhythms were no longer our own. Breakfast had to be on the table by his clock. Silence fell during the evening prayers, and lights were to be out by the time he decided. If a dish had the faintest streak, he pointed it out with his finger, shaming me with a glance. "Sloppiness invites trouble," he'd mutter, as if my mother's death had been caused by dirty plates. At the table I sat rigid, careful with my fork and knife, terrified of making a sound that might displease him. My brothers, sensing the tension, grew quiet too. He seized the family's finances almost immediately. The jar above the sink was emptied, the coins counted one by one in his palm. "I'll handle things from now on," he said. My father, drowning in grief, nodded numbly. Richard returned from town with receipts and ledgers, speaking as though he were now head of the household. On trips to the store, I walked 2 steps behind him, carrying the bags while he carried authority. He rationed flour and sugar, demanding explanations if a handful seemed missing. I began hiding scraps of bread in my apron to feed my brothers, my heart racing with every secret bite. His control extended to my posture, my voice, even my laughter. "Young ladies don't bare their teeth," he'd correct me if I smiled too widely. He forbade me from going to the creek alone, limited my errands to church and school, and always seemed to know who I spoke to. The neighbors admired his concern. "Those children are lucky," they'd say. I nodded, swallowing the truth like poison. Inside I felt myself shrinking strand by strand, until the girl I'd been was nothing more than a thread tucked away in some hidden drawer. The first time I realized he was mapping my body came under the pretense of helping, with a dress. "Too loose," he said, pulling out a tape measure. My father was in the fields, my brothers in the yard. Richard draped the tape across my shoulders, moving slowly, deliberately. "Hold still," he murmured, his breath smelling of cheap cologne. He wrote numbers in a little notebook, though I never saw him take the fabric to a seamstress. I felt catalogued, exposed, as though my very skin had been filed away for his keeping. Nights became the worst. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, at the same time every evening. Once the door to my room creaked open. He stood in the doorway, shadow cutting through the light of the hall. "Just checking that everything's in order," he whispered. His eyes swept the room, pausing on me. I pulled the quilt to my chin, feigning sleep. He smiled faintly, closed the door, and left. But the violation remained. From then on I slept with my shoes on, clutching my mother's Bible beneath my pillow, as if its pages could shield me. At church, he was a model of piety, kneeling in the front pew, murmuring Latin phrases, offering to chop wood for widows. People adored his devotion. They never saw the way his words twisted when we walked home. If I commented on the sermon, he silenced me with a raised brow. Faith doesn't need childish opinions. I learned to pray in silence, moving my lips only inside my head so that God could hear me, but Richard could not. School, once my sanctuary, grew tainted too. My handwriting shrank. My voice faltered when reading aloud. One afternoon, he insisted on waiting outside to speak with the teacher. I felt his presence through the window, his pocket watch clicking open and shut. When I emerged, he gripped my arm too tightly. "You took your time," he said flatly. That watch snapped shut like a verdict. From then on, I saw time itself as another chain he controlled. The bruises began subtly. A rough squeeze of my shoulder when he corrected me. A shove, too, keep me from spilling hot water. A grip around my wrist when I reached too slowly for something. I wore long sleeves, even in the heat, and explained away my clumsiness. I set cups precariously on shelves so they'd clatter if anyone entered, warning me in the night. Sound became my ally. If glass rattled or a chair scraped, I knew to be alert, ready to feign sleep or invent an excuse. Neighbors came with bread or news, but Richard intercepted them with his calm smile. "Eugenia's busy with chores," he'd say. When Mrs. Thompson invited me to help at the bakery, he replied, "Best not to waste time gossiping." My world shrank into walls I no longer recognized as mine. The streets outside became like paintings behind glass, visible but untouchable. The house began to reflect him. Pictures hung straight with almost military precision. Chairs aligned like soldiers. Crumbs forbidden. I memorized where the floorboards creaked and where they were safe. Practiced moving silently, even when carrying buckets. Once I found a needle left, conspicuously on the floor of the hallway. I stepped around it carefully, certain it was another test. Disorder was his trap, and my punishment if I failed was inevitable. Winter came with his decree. All doors must be left ajar for safety. My sanctuary vanished. I created makeshift barricades, a chair tilted against the door, a blanket strung across as a curtain, anything that might buy me seconds if he came. My brothers slept soundly, oblivious. I watched, eyes burning from sleeplessness, heart drumming until dawn. One evening, while peeling potatoes, I felt him behind me. He leaned close, covering my hand with his as I held the knife. Clumsy hands cut themselves, he murmured against my neck. He withdrew slowly, leaving the blade gleaming in the light. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had. From then on, every knife was a reminder of his threat, every shadow a potential strike. His authority dressed itself in proverbs. Reputation is glass, he'd warn. A decent girl is quiet. A household thrives on silence. Whenever I dared argue, he'd invoke my brothers. "Do you want them to suffer because of you?" And I silenced myself. Protecting them became my only purpose. I channeled my terror into tasks. Scrubbing, cooking, praying. Inside, I counted. Steps, breaths, seconds. Like a soldier waiting out the storm. Outside, he charmed men at the hardware store, laughing with them, accepting their praise. "Richard's an old-fashioned man of principle," they said. Their words spun around me like smoke, suffocating. It was a world upside down, where virtue wore a mask and cruelty hid behind courtesy. I realized then that truth requires an opening, and until that opening came, my job was to remain unbroken. One night, the lantern blew out suddenly, plunging the room into blackness. I stumbled, striking my hip against the table's edge. Pain shot through me and I gasped. His whisper slid into the dark. "You hurt yourself when you disobey." No one saw. In the eye. "Morning over breakfast," he remarked. "She's careless." My bruised body, my swollen eyes were hidden behind a veil of silence. Gradually, he began speaking for my father too. Finances, chores, church obligations. Richard made the decisions. If I tried to speak, he cut me off with his smile. "I'll handle it." My father, lost in grief, simply nodded. I longed to shake him awake, but he was locked in his sorrow. Richard offered him a hallway of order, and he walked it blindly. I couldn't hate him for it, but it deepened my loneliness. The kitchen became my battleground. I prepped meals in silence, arranging every dish to avoid his criticism. Once he caught me slipping a biscuit to Duke, our dog. His eyes narrowed. "Charity starts with obedience," he said, forcing me to pick up each crumb. I dug my nails into my palms until they left crescents. Grounding myself in pain, I chose. His comments on my body grew sharper. "You're growing," he said one day, handing me a box of pins. "Watch how you walk." My body, once just mine for running and climbing, became an object under surveillance. I wore looser dresses, draped scarves, tried to disappear into fabric. The mirror no longer reflected me. It reflected danger. Sometimes he demanded I read aloud from the Bible, watching me intently. If I stumbled, he made me repeat the verse until my throat went raw. Always passages about purity, obedience, submission. He closed the book with a satisfied clap. Afterward, I tucked the Bible under my pillow, hoping my mother's hands lingered there more than his eyes. My brothers, innocent still, once built a fort from blankets. Their laughter filled the room. Richard entered, yanked the blankets down, and said coldly, "This isn't a circus." The joy evaporated. He sent them to study and lingered on me with his gaze. My chest tightened as if I'd run miles, though I hadn't moved an inch. Later, I whispered stories to my brothers in bed, trying to stitch back a little of the magic he had ripped away. The backyard became my secret confessional. Kneeling in the dirt, feeding chickens or pulling weeds, I let tears mingle with dust. There, under the open sky, I felt my mother closer. I begged her to guide me, to show me a way through. Her memory was my thread back to myself, her voice the rope I clung to. When he demanded to see my schoolwork, I hid my real writings inside the pages. Recipes covered notes. Cornbread, flour, water, salt, followed by Thursday 9 p.m., door left open. I tucked the notebook into the coal bin, smudging my fingers black. I told myself the dirt was worth the truth. With my brothers, I invented a game called The Light. If I ever shouted light, they were to run to 3 hiding spots, under the table, behind the quilts, inside the pantry. They thought it was play. For me, it was training. Their laughter masked my dread, but at least I knew they'd have a chance if things turned worse. Prayer shifted too. I no longer asked for miracles, only clarity. At church, I sat a few rows back, studying who entered and who lingered. Once I left a folded note on the pew. Praying isn't enough. No name, no detail. Just a spark of defiance hidden among the hymns. I learned to translate his words. Precaution meant control. Care meant surveillance. Naming his lies silently helped me stay sane. I noticed inconsistencies, cracks in his stories, repeated phrases. I tucked them away like matches, knowing one day they'd ignite. One afternoon, when he reached to correct my posture, I shifted my chair half an inch. His hand fell into empty space. He blinked, startled, then covered it with a smile. I lowered my gaze as if apologizing, but inside, a victory rang through me. That half inch was mine. I began sewing coins into my dress hem, small change Mrs. Thompson slipped me for helping at the bakery. It wasn't much, but it meant independence. A bus ticket, a stamp, an escape fund. Each stitch whispered, "You will not own me." The slight weight tugged on the fabric, reminding me that the future was still possible. And finally, I let myself laugh again, though only inside. Not loud enough for him to hear, but in those hidden moments, when Duke chased his tail, when my brothers' faces were smeared with flour, when the teacher winked at me in passing, I let the laughter bloom in my chest. He could control the house, the schedules, even my movements, but not that quiet ember of joy. I held it close, certain that someday it would become a flame. Silence became my closest companion. I learned to swallow words before they left my lips, to answer only when necessary, and never with too much detail. At first that quiet shielded me, keeping Richard's suspicions at bay. But soon I realized silence wasn't just my armor, it was also my prison. Each day I spoke less, and each day I felt myself fading a little more, as though I were turning invisible inside my own home. Sleep abandoned me. At night I lay awake, listening for the creak of footsteps in the hallway, the shift of shadows on the wall. I started sleeping in my clothes, shoes by the bed, ready to run if I needed to. When exhaustion finally dragged me under, dreams came twisted. My mother singing in the kitchen, only to have Richard appear behind her. I woke with my heart racing, my palms damp, already bracing for the day ahead. I carved out secret hiding places where I could breathe. Behind the curtains, in the chicken coop, even crouched near the woodpile. In the shed, those corners became my confessionals, where I let tears slip freely. When my brothers laughed, oblivious, I forced myself to smile with them, to invent stories of cowboys and heroes, to shield them from the storm. Their innocence was my mission. Protecting it was the only thing that made my own suffering bearable. I hid my bruises beneath loose dresses and long sleeves, even when the summer heat pressed against my skin. When neighbors asked if I was cold, I forced a laugh. The marks, fingers on my arms, shadows on my back, were easy to explain away with clumsiness. The mirror showed me someone I barely recognized. Not the laughing girl I had been, but a hollow-eyed stranger who knew too much. My body carried the truth that my lips denied. My stomach knotted, my hands trembled, my throat tightened when I tried to speak. Sickness took root without a name. Richard played the part of caretaker for the town. The poor girl is fragile, he'd say, shaking his head with concern. People praised his devotion. I choked on the bitter irony. My fragility was his doing, yet he wore it as his badge of honor. I leaned on routine as a mask. I rose early, cooked, swept, hauled water, scrubbed clothes. Each act performed with precision, each task repeated with mechanical care. If I left a plate smudged or a shirt wrinkled, Richard's eyes pierced through me. Useless, ungrateful, stupid. His words branded deeper than any bruise. Over time, I began to believe them. The "ay" silence made room for those voices to echo unchecked inside me. Fear rewired my movements. I tiptoed across floorboards, closed doors with barely a sound, arranged spoons carefully so they wouldn't clink. I became a shadow in my own house, a ghost performing chores. My brothers thought I was simply quiet, but I knew better. I was disappearing piece by piece, surviving by erasing myself. The silence stretched into the town. At school, I stopped speaking to classmates. I no longer lingered with neighbors. I was always wary that Richard might have ears everywhere. If anyone asked how I was, I replied quickly, "Fine, thank you," before retreating. Deep down, I sensed no one wanted to push further. Richard's polished reputation was a wall too high for them to climb. I built small rituals of defiance. At the end of the day, I stole a crust of bread and ate it alone, savoring it as if it were a feast. In the margins of my notebooks, I scribbled words like endure, live, resist. Those scraps were embers hidden in ash, proof that I still belonged to myself. Nights remained the hardest. Each groan of the houseboard set my teeth on edge. Sometimes I crept outside, sitting near the chicken coop, staring at the stars. Out there, with the cool night pressing against my skin, I imagined my mother looking down at me. I whispered to her, begging for strength. The faith that she still listened was the only thing keeping me upright. Necessity made me sharp. I studied Richard's moods, learning to predict his movements like reading weather signs. A twitch in his jaw, a tightening of his grip on the chair. These became warnings. Anticipation was survival. It was like living in a silent war, where my battlefield was the kitchen floor, and my weapon was foresight. My brothers grew without noticing the shadows hanging over us. They played, laughed, and studied, while I orchestrated behind the scenes. I made sure they never saw my fear, never felt the weight pressing on me. They curled against me at night, trusting me with their dreams. That trust was my anchor, the reason I didn't crumble. There were moments I feared I was losing my mind. Whispers seemed to come from the silence. Shapes flickered in the corner of my vision. I bit my lips until they bled, using the sting to hold myself together. No one could hear me cry. If they did, they might start asking, and asking was dangerous. Days blurred together. Chores, silence, vigilance. Time no longer moved in weeks or months, but in cycles of dread and relief. Seasons shifted outside, but inside the house everything remained frozen under Richard's shadow. Sometimes I wondered if I would ever be free, or if life would always be measured in footsteps and whispers. My body betrayed me further. I grew thin, my clothes sagging, my cheeks hollowed, my eyes dulled. People said it was grief for my mother. They nodded at Richard, praising him for taking care of us. Each compliment to him felt like a knife. I wanted to scream the truth, but the silence locked my jaw. The only voice I allowed myself was my mother's, preserved in the letters she had left me. I hid them in her Bible, tucked between the worn pages. When I felt weakest, I opened them and read her words. "Trust, daughter. This will pass." Those sentences kept me alive. At night I whispered them as if they were prayers, tasting her love in every syllable. But silence wasn't just keeping secrets from others. It was erasing me from myself. I became a phantom drifting through my own story, invisible to the world. Yet deep inside, I held on to a flicker that refused to die. That stubborn spark was small, but it told me, not everything has been taken. Some days that spark nearly went out. When his cruelty pressed hardest, when exhaustion left me trembling, I thought of giving in. But then I saw my brothers' sleeping faces, so peaceful, so trusting. Their existence reignited my will. I couldn't abandon them. Each night I promised myself, just one more day. Survive one more day. Silence was my shield, yes, but it was also my cage. With it I kept Richard at bay. With it I hid from the neighbors, from my father, even from my own reflection. I carried it like armor, but it weighed heavier than chains. I didn't yet know that in that silence resistance was being born, that my stillness would one day turn into a storm. And so I lived, day after day, a ghost, disguised as a daughter, a sister, a housekeeper, my voice buried, my laughter gone. But inside, hidden in the smallest corners, I was planting seeds, seeds of words, of defiance, of memory. Someday, I told myself, they would grow. The first sign of resistance was so small it could have been mistaken for nothing. I began waking half an hour earlier than Richard. In that sliver of time, with the sky still dark and the chickens still quiet, I boiled water and sat at the table with a stub of pencil. On scraps of paper I wrote a sentence or two. I'm still here. I won't break. Today. I hid the notes in the flour sack. That tiny ritual anchored me. Even if the rest of the day was stolen, those words were mine alone. I started studying Richard the way a soldier studies the enemy. His habits became patterns I could exploit. After lunch, he always checked the pantry, then stepped outside to smoke, thinking no one noticed. In those minutes, I hurried to school to leave my brother's small snacks, slipping them wrapped in cloth. I whispered to them to remember Mrs. Thompson at the bakery if they ever needed help. I never said why, but their nods reassured me. That preparation gave me purpose. My teacher, Mrs. Harris, became another quiet ally. One day she pressed a box of pencils into my hand with no explanation. "For your essays," she said. Her eyes lingered on mine, steady, knowing. At home I copied certain words, dignity, choice, courage, on the inside of a drawer where I kept rags. Every time I opened it, I whispered them under my breath. Those words were like matches in the dark. I learned to use lies as tools, not sins. Short, simple ones. Yes, I'll do it. You're right. Each lie bought me space. Behind them I mapped exits. The back door unlocked, a chair positioned to fall loudly, a bucket left ready to tip. I even invented signals with my brothers, turning ordinary objects into codes. A red ribbon in the window meant stay outside. A crooked vase meant all was safe. It was our hidden language of survival. Sometimes I tested the limits on purpose. I'd spill a little flour, watching how long before his jaw tightened. I marked the safe moments, the calm after church, the hours before supper, when he was distracted enough for me to sneak a cookie to my brothers or to smile without punishment. Those tiny acts became my victories, strung together like pearls only I could see. I also tried to reclaim my body in private. When Richard's grip left bruises, I traced the marks myself, softly saying, "This is still mine." In the mirror I tied scarves not only to cover myself, but as quiet banners of choice. A color, a knot, a fabric. It was my way of saying I hadn't disappeared entirely. Mrs. Thompson, the baker, seemed to sense more than she said. Once, when I arrived pale and shaky, she handed me sugared water. "For the scare," she murmured. Her hand brushed mine, and in that fleeting touch I felt less alone. From then on she became my messenger, slipping coins into my palm when I helped her scrub pans. I sewed them into the hem of my dress, each stitch whispering, "This is for your freedom." The notebook hidden in the coal bin grew heavy with entries. I wrote not only feelings, but details. Times he lingered in the hall, phrases he repeated, dates when bruises appeared. To anyone else it looked like recipes. But to me, it was proof. I stained my fingers black retrieving it, thinking, if truth has a price, let it be coal dust. I turned survival into a game for my brothers. I called it, "Find the light." If I shouted light, they had to run and hide in one of 3 spots. To them it was fun. To me, it was training. They laughed, timing themselves, never knowing I was rehearsing for danger. Their giggles gave me a rare moment of strength, reminding me why I endured. My prayers changed too. I stopped asking God to erase Richard. Instead, I asked for a way out, for a door I could see clearly. At church, I sat farther back, observing. I once slipped a note under a hymnal. Prayer is not enough. No name, no details, just a spark left behind for whoever might stumble on it. I taught myself to translate Richard's words. Precaution meant control. Care meant surveillance. Naming the lies, even silently, helped me resist being swallowed by them. I collected his contradictions, storing them like kindling. One day I told myself I'll strike a match. One afternoon, when he tried to adjust my chair, I slid half an inch away. His hand grasped air. His surprise flashed before he masked it with a smile. I lowered my gaze, pretending submission. Inside I celebrated. That half-inch of space was mine. Every coin I hid, every signal I invented, every word I scribbled was proof I hadn't surrendered. And when my brothers made me laugh, a smudge of flour on their cheeks, a silly face, they lit a fire in my chest I refused to let him touch. Richard could control the house, the routines, even the air I breathed, but not the small flame I carried inside. That flame, I knew, would one day grow into something unstoppable. The day everything shifted began like countless others. Rooster crowing, frost on the porch, the smell of coffee rising from the kitchen. But Richard's tone at breakfast was different. "You're coming with me today," he said flatly. No explanation, no room for refusal. My stomach tightened. He led me past the hardware store, past Main Street, down a dirt path towards the woods. My feet dragged as if the earth itself was warning me. He walked in silence, his grip firm on my elbow. When Tisa hitched it, we reached a clearing by the creek. He stopped. The mask he always wore slipped away. His eyes narrowed, his smile thin, and I understood instantly. This wasn't about errands. He stepped closer, his hand reaching as though to claim me. My breath caught in my chest, fear rooting me in place. Then out of somewhere deeper than fear came a sound I didn't know I could make. I screamed. Not the high cry of a child, but a raw animal howl that tore through the trees. Richard lunged to cover my mouth, but it was too late. 2 women gathering kindling nearby froze, their baskets spilling onto the ground. One bolted toward town, the other stared horrified. The silence was broken, and nothing could stitch it back. Richard's fingers dug into my arm, his voice hissing, "Say one word and it'll be worse for all of you." But his hands trembled, and in that tremor I saw something I'd never seen before. His fear. I held his gaze, steady for the first time. My body still shook, but my eyes did not. For the first time, he looked smaller. The walk back to town was suffocating. Whispers spread faster than our steps. Curtains twitched, heads turned. Richard straightened his back, greeting neighbors with forced cheer. I walked beside him, hair disheveled, face flushed, not bothering to hide. Let them see, I thought. Let them see what he's done. My silence had cracked open, and I would not patch it shut again. That afternoon, Mrs. Harris knocked at our door, clutching a stack of papers. Richard welcomed her politely, but she ignored him, stepping closer to me. "Are you all right, Eugenia?" she asked softly. My lips wouldn't form the words, but my eyes filled with tears. She saw them. She believed me without proof. That simple belief steadied me more than anything else could. That night the house was unbearable. His steps in the hallway were louder, angrier, each creak a threat. My brothers slept against me, unaware, their breaths soft and even. I kept watch, my heart pounding, but this time I wasn't completely alone. Outside those walls, the town had begun to whisper. The truth was no longer mine to carry in silence. Richard doubled down on his performance at church, bowing lower, praying louder, offering to fix fences for widows. But I stopped lowering my head. I walked in with my chin lifted, shoulders back, even if my legs trembled. That small act was my declaration. I would not vanish anymore. Fear still clawed at me, but it no longer dictated every step. Mrs. Harris visited often under small pretenses, returning a book, checking homework. Each time she looked directly into my eyes, silently promising help. Her presence was a doorway cracked open. I didn't step through yet, but knowing it was there gave me breath, gave me hope. One evening, Richard cornered me in the kitchen. "What do you think you're accomplishing with these little shows?" he sneered. My heart raced, but I whispered, "I'm showing that you can't erase me." His jaw clenched. For the first time, he had no answer. The silence he'd always used against me was turned back on him. The tension grew unbearable. My brothers began to sense the storm, though they didn't understand it. They clung to me more, asking why Uncle Richard was so stern. I couldn't tell them the truth, but I held them tighter, whispering stories to keep their childhood intact. Their innocence was my shield and my burden. The breaking point came one morning when Richard blocked the door. "You don't need school anymore," he said, standing tall, filling the frame. My pulse hammered in my ears. "Yes, I do," I replied, voice steady. "I need to learn how to be free." Then I grabbed my brother's hands and pushed past him. He stumbled just enough for us to slip outside. The cold air slapped my face like a baptism. I had crossed a line I could never return from. At the schoolhouse, Mrs. Harris closed the door behind us and, for the first time, pulled me into her arms. I let myself collapse into that embrace, feeling a strength I had long forgotten. It wasn't just her arms around me. It was the proof that I wasn't invisible, that my suffering had been seen. That hug was the crack of dawn after a long, merciless night. I knew then there was no going back. The silence that had once caged me was broken. I had screamed, I had stood tall, I had defied him. Richard's power was no longer absolute. A door had opened, and even if it terrified me to step through, I knew I would never again be locked inside the dark. When I think back to that moment, I realize it was like a window opening after years of suffocation. Richard tried to keep his grip on the family, tried to rebuild the mask he wore so well, but the town no longer saw him the same. Mrs. Harris spoke to the pastor. Mrs. Thompson whispered to her neighbors, and slowly the truth spread. His reputation cracked, and with it, his hold on us. I didn't need to scream the details. Just standing tall, just letting people see me, was enough to unravel the lie he had lived behind. Help came in small but powerful ways. Neighbors invited my brothers to spend afternoons at their houses. Women dropped by to bring recipes, or ask for help with sewing, but I knew what they were really doing, keeping watch over me. Richard, sensing eyes on him, began to spend less time at our home. And then one day, he was simply gone. He didn't leave a note, didn't say goodbye. He slipped away, and though the silence of his absence felt strange at first, it soon became the greatest relief I'd ever known. My father, buried so deep in his grief, had been blind to so much. But when I finally showed him the notebook where I had hidden my words, my accounts, my truths, he wept like a child. He didn't apologize. Perhaps he didn't know how. But he took my hands and said, "You'll never be alone again." That was enough. It was late, but it was still love. The house slowly filled again with ordinary sounds. My brother's laughter, Duke's barking, the creak of the rocking chair, the bubbling of stew on the stove. I even began to hum while cooking, like my mother once had. It wasn't the same song, and my voice was thinner, but it was a start. Survival, I realized, wasn't just about enduring pain. It was about relearning joy, about daring to smile even after the storm. Now looking back, I see that the girl who learned to keep quiet too soon also learned to rise. I carry the scars of silence and fear, but I also carry the proof that I was never erased. That girl grew into a woman who found her voice, even if it shook, even if it took decades to let it out. And in speaking now, I know I've finally chosen freedom. That's why I share this with you, not just as memory, but as a warning and as a hand stretched out. Silence doesn't protect us. It cages us. Shame doesn't belong to those who suffer, but to those who cause suffering. And no matter how deep the darkness, there is always a spark waiting to catch fire. If this part of my story has touched you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it. It means the world to me to know these words reach others who might need them. And tell me in the comments, what did you feel walking with me through this story? Your words will give strength not just to me, but to others who are listening in silence. Today, at 74, I am a widow, a grandmother, a woman who still sells her cornbread at the Saturday market. But I am no longer the invisible girl I once was. I am Eugenia, the woman who screamed when no one expected it, the woman who stood her ground. My voice is mine now, and I will carry it until my last breath.